Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that hits close to the bone because it's about betrayal. The kind that doesn't come from strangers, but from the very people you once carried in your arms. You probably won't survive this story unless you've got a thick skin, because the details sting like cold wind against an old scar. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to watch the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. I know some of you are watching from your beds, some from little kitchens with humming refrigerators, some even with earbuds on the bus, pretending you're not eavesdropping on the people next to you. Wherever you are, I want you here with me. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's comfortably embark on tonight's journey. I raised them alone. That's the truth that nobody in this family can erase. When their parents faltered, my daughter swallowed by her own battles, my son-in-law walking out with no more than a shrug, it was me who stepped into the silence. I can still feel the ache in my back from nights I bent over school books, helping tiny hands form letters when I could barely keep my own eyes open. Single mothers are praised in stories, but grandmothers who become mothers twice over. People don't talk about that. They call it helping out as if it were an after-school favor, not the scaffolding that kept their lives upright. There were nights so quiet that the only sound was the tick of the old clock on the wall and the soft sighs of children asleep in the next room. I'd sit there at the kitchen table with bills spread out, wondering if milk and bread would stretch till payday. Statistics say that 1 in 4 families relies heavily on grandparents for day-to-day child-rearing. But statistics don't capture the smell of your shirt after scrubbing someone's sheets at midnight, or the way loneliness curls around you when you tuck in kids who aren't supposed to be yours. Sometimes I found humor in the strangest places, like the time I made a birthday cake from pancake mix because I couldn't afford a real one. The kids didn't care. They blew out the candles and cheered like it was made of gold. I laughed then too quietly because when the frosting slid off one side, I told them it was a gravity cake, a scientific experiment. They repeated that phrase for years. That was joke number 1, my little trick against despair. But sacrifice has a strange taste. At first it's sweet, you feel noble like a guardian angel swooping in. Then it turns bitter, like medicine taken too often. My hands grew rough, my knees ached from kneeling on floors to pick up their toys, but every wrinkle I earned seemed to hold a memory of them. People still debate whether children ever notice these sacrifices, or if love that quiet simply dissolves in the air like steam, unrecognized. I wonder if mine evaporated before it ever sank into their skin. Cultural customs vary. In some places, grandmothers like me are honored as the hearth keepers. In Japan, there's even a word oyakoko, meaning filial piety, the sacred duty children have toward parents and elders. In my culture, we talk about respect at the dinner table, yet when the plates are cleared, the respect is too. I learned that contradiction slowly, the way you notice winter creeping into your bones one chilly morning at a time. Back in those early years, though, I carried hope like a lantern. I remember one winter when the snow piled high outside the windows. We didn't have enough for a heater that year, so I gathered them in my bed. We huddled like wolves, our breaths making tiny clouds in the cold air. Their giggles warmed me more than any blanket. That memory has stayed stitched into me, proof that love can be as fierce as fire. But funny enough, wolves eventually grow and leave the den. They don't look back at the one who kept them alive. That's joke number 2, the cruel humor of biology itself. I don't pretend I was perfect. I lost my patience more than once. I yelled about muddy shoes on clean floors and cried silently when I thought they couldn't hear. Parenting, grandparenting, whatever you call it, it's messy. There are no medals for getting through a day when everyone is fed, clothed, and loved. There's only exhaustion. And yet, I believed with a stubborn kind of faith that one day they would look back and see me as the anchor, not the burden. The odd thing is, the anchor begins to rust in silence. I spent so much time being the strong one that no one saw me cracking. I wanted anyone to ask, "How are you holding up?" But those words never came. Instead, I was the dependable background, the reliable chair you never notice until it breaks. One summer evening, as fireflies danced in the garden, I caught myself whispering, "I hope they remember this." The smell of grilled corn, the laughter of cousins running barefoot across the lawn, it felt like a movie scene. I stood there watching, feeling both proud and invisible. That's joke number 3 in your own story. You're both the hero and the ghost. Family dynamics can be strange. Researchers say multi-generational households often produce resilient children, but they also produce blurred boundaries. Who's the parent? Who's the guardian? Who makes the rules? I wore all hats at once: nurse, teacher, cook, judge, and playmate. And yet, when the children grew, they hung their hats on new hooks, forgetting mine ever existed. There's one night etched into me more sharply than the others. A fever ran through the youngest one so high I feared he'd slip away in my arms. I pressed damp cloths to his forehead, whispered prayers into the dark, and felt the hours drag like chains. By dawn, he stirred and called me Mama. My heart swelled and broke in the same breath, because I knew the world would remind him later that I was not Mama, I was just the substitute. People still debate whether love like that, born out of desperation and necessity, carries the same weight as parental love. I think it carries more, but I admit I'm biased. Looking back now, sitting here in this quiet room that isn't my own, I wonder what those silent sacrifices add up to. Are they threads in a tapestry no one will ever hang, or are they invisible ink only revealed in rare light, I suppose? The cruelest truth is this: I gave everything, and they remember almost nothing. But tonight as I speak, I want you to imagine those long nights, the hush of a house where children sleep safe, because one old woman stayed awake. Imagine the heart that beats steady, not for her own dreams, but for theirs. And then ask yourself, if love is invisible, does it still count? Or does it vanish the moment no one notices the small victories? Funny how they shine so brightly in my memory, like glitter sprinkled on an otherwise gray road. When you're raising children without applause, those tiny triumphs feel like standing ovations. I still remember the first time one of them tied his own shoelaces without my help. You'd think he'd just solved world peace from the way I clapped and cheered. He rolled his eyes embarrassed, but that smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth told me he loved it. That's the thing about children, they pretend they don't care, but they always register when someone is rooting for them. Studies even show that consistent encouragement, however small, creates lasting self-esteem in young adults. You can't measure that on a chart, but I lived it. There were other moments, too. The first A on a spelling test. The first time she rode a bike down the driveway without toppling over. The way they lined up their mismatched stuffed animals for a graduation ceremony after finishing kindergarten. These were the things that stitched meaning into the fabric of my life. Of course, the world sees them as ordinary milestones, but to me, they were miracles. After all, when you've been left with nothing but responsibility, every spark of progress feels like evidence you're not failing. Still, I carried the shadow of exhaustion. No one told me parenting twice would feel like sprinting a marathon while juggling flaming torches. Some days I collapsed into bed so tired I couldn't even dream. And yet when morning came, I was up again packing lunches, combing tangles out of their hair, and taping together the shoes we couldn't afford to replace. I laughed once when duct tape became my best fashion accessory. That was joke number 1 for this round, Grandma Couture, I called it. The kids giggled and pretended to model their taped-up sneakers like they were runway stars. You know, psychologists often say children remember how you made them feel, not the material things you gave them. But here's the debate. Do they remember long enough to let that gratitude shape how they treat you later? Or does it evaporate as soon as their own lives get busy? People still debate whether love from the past guarantees loyalty in the future. I've got my doubts now sitting where I am. One odd fact I discovered in those years was about inheritance laws. Did you know that in some states, if you raise grandchildren without ever formally adopting them, you might not even be recognized as their legal guardian in financial matters later? That means legally, all those years of sacrifice could vanish into thin air on paper like they never happened. Isn't that wild? I sometimes think the law mirrors family life too well. It forgets the ones who do the heavy lifting. But back then, I didn't worry about paperwork. I was too busy celebrating the victories, like when we scraped enough together for a secondhand piano. The keys were chipped, and one stuck on middle C, but my granddaughter practiced every day until she played a halting version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I recorded it on an old phone and played it back so many times the speaker went fuzzy. The pride in her eyes was worth more than any new instrument. And me, I cried right there in the living room, hoping they didn't notice. That moment was proof resilience can make music even out of broken things. There were holidays, too. I couldn't afford fancy gifts, but I turned rapping into a performance. Once I disguised a pair of socks by hiding them inside a cereal box, watching them rip open the package only to burst out laughing. That was joy. That was joke number 2, the breakfast that warms your feet. The laughter rang louder than the disappointment of not having toys. I wanted them to know humor was a shield, one we could use even against poverty. And then there was the science fair project. He wanted to build a volcano, and I couldn't deny him. We stayed up all night crafting it from papier-mâché my kitchen, looking like a battlefield of flour and glue. When it finally erupted on stage with baking soda foam spilling over, the other kids gasped. He didn't win first prize, but he beamed as if he'd conquered Everest. And me, I stood in the back, clapping with tears running down my cheeks, whispering to myself, "We did it." That was joke number 3, I told him. "Next time we'll use real lava." He grinned, not knowing how true it felt to me, because raising him was already like walking on lava, dangerous, but unstoppable. The strange thing is victories fade faster for them than they do for us. For me, every step they took was tattooed on my heart. For them, it was just Tuesday. They moved on hungry for the next thing while I stayed there holding the memory like a pressed flower in an old book. That's the cruel mismatch of generations. One clings, the other forgets. There were whispers even then, though I didn't want to hear them. Teachers sometimes said, "They're so independent, so driven." They credited the kids as they should, but rarely looked at me. It was like I was the invisible scaffolding holding up a building necessary but never admired. People still debate whether children succeed because of innate talent or because someone carried them on their shoulders unseen. I know my answer. And through all of this, I convinced myself it was enough. That one day when they were older, they would look back and say, "Grandma made this possible." But that recognition never came. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe victories are meant to belong only to those who win them, not to the ones who cleared the path. As I sit here now with the faint buzz of fluorescent lights above me and the smell of institutional soup lingering in the air, I wonder if they ever replay those moments in their minds. Do they remember the pancake cake, the taped shoes, the fake volcano, or are they just anecdotes buried in my chest, never to be spoken of again? I don't know. And perhaps the saddest truth is that I may never know. But those small victories, they were real. They mattered even if I was the only one who held on to them. A grandmother's love versus youthful ambition. That's the tension that never lets up. I see it clearly now the first time I realized the depth of the divide. My granddaughter wanted to go to a summer program abroad. She was only 16 and her eyes sparkled with excitement as she described the city, the workshops, the independence. And I felt that familiar ache, the pull between pride and fear. I wanted her to soar, but I also wanted to tether her to the home I had built with sweat patience and sleepless nights. Mainstream family dynamics tell us this is normal. Children are meant to leave to chase their own lives to test boundaries, but the heart doesn't come with an instruction manual. I remember pacing the living room that night, the air thick with heat from the old radiator, wondering if I had prepared her enough to stand on her own. Fringe fact, some cultures actually delay sending children away until their mid-20s, insisting that intergenerational households provide stability that school systems cannot. In those nights, I imagined what that would have been like for me, to keep them close longer to ensure that my presence was not just a memory, but a continuous thread in their lives. People still debate whether early independence helps children thrive or sets them adrift. I suppose it depends on whose eyes you're looking through. Humor became my quiet rebellion again. I told her that if she left for the city, she'd probably return smelling like strange cheeses and impatient taxis. She rolled her eyes and snorted, calling me old-fashioned. But joke number 1 of this segment landed Don't be surprised if you come home one day and find me on TikTok teaching cats to skateboard." We laughed, and for a moment the tension dissolved. I had sacrificed so much, and yet I could see ambition lighting up their faces like fireworks. My children, my grandchildren, they were fueled by dreams I had no time to entertain. I worked, I cooked, I taught, I healed. But ambition has its own gravity, and even my gravity could not hold them in place forever. The distance grew small at first, a skipped call, a postponed visit, but then like a tide, it pulled them further from me. I tried to understand it. I really did. After all, when I was their age, I longed for the unknown too. But the heart wants what it wants, and the body can only give so much. I remember standing in the doorway of the old house watching her leave, with her suitcase rolling behind her, and feeling both elation and despair. "That was joke number 2, I whispered to myself. "Go on, find adventure. And don't forget to call me when you're famous." Strangely, the legal system recognizes ambition over attachment in some cases. Guardianship laws can allow children to make major life decisions at surprisingly young ages, while grandparents like me are left out of the equation if the paperwork is incomplete. I learned that the hard way when a school wanted written permission for a field trip, and I realized my official status had limits that my love did not. The dichotomy was bitter. Emotionally, I had been the parent. Legally, I was the bystander. I also recall the evenings spent helping with homework, the countless nights spent coaxing reluctant readers to decipher paragraphs that seemed alien to them. They didn't see the gray hair sprouting in clumps or the tired lines etched into my face. Instead, they saw guidance structure and sometimes annoyance. They didn't realize that each correction, each gentle nudge was a stitch in the fabric that kept them from unraveling. People still debate whether invisible labor counts as real influence. I assure you it does. Just ask any grandmother who raised children alone. There were moments of joy, too, despite the friction. I remember a school recital, the kind where parents sit in folding chairs and clap awkwardly at each note. I had arranged the front row seats, baked cookies for the intermission, and cheered with all my lungs. My granddaughter's fingers trembled on the piano keys, but she played with passion. I could feel her heartbeat in sync with mine, an unspoken bond, fleeting but potent. I whispered to myself, "This is why we survive the lonely nights." Yet ambition has its cost. When the city beckoned, they began to drift emotionally too. A missed phone call here, a delayed text there. I'd see photos online her, laughing with new friends, his experiments in the science lab, achievements that should have been celebrated with me, yet I was a ghost in the gallery of their lives. Even grandparents who have poured decades into nurturing often find themselves erased in the story their grandchildren write for the world. I remember one debate with my son-in-law over a minor decision. He wanted her to focus on extracurriculars that I thought were pointless, and I argued for balance. He dismissed me gently, politely, but firmly. That was the moment I realized my authority, once unquestioned, had dissolved. Authority built on years of care is fragile when ambition arrives. I could only smile, laugh lightly, and concede because if I tried to resist, I'd risk alienation entirely. Humor again became my armor. I told him, "Just don't let her discover that you can't fold a fitted sheet without crying." He chuckled, a little awkward, and we moved on. Joke number 3, my own secret rebellion hiding behind humor while watching the edges of my family blur. Evenings grew quieter. The living room, once alive with laughter and debates, became a waiting room for the next phone call or visit. I reminded myself that independence was a gift. And yet the ache remained. Mainstream dynamics say that children leaving home is natural, even beneficial. Fringe customs. Some cultures celebrate a child's departure with elaborate ceremonies, almost as if the act of leaving is a rite of passage to be honored publicly. I had no ceremony, just a quiet hallway echoing with the faint hum of my own heartbeat. But through it all, I clung to the small victories. The first time she called from the train station, safely. The first essay she wrote without my corrections. The first science experiment that succeeded on its own. Each one was a whisper to my heart, you raised them, you built them strong. And even if they forget, the world will remember. And yet I knew deep down that love alone doesn't prevent distance. Ambition pulls, and even the most devoted hearts can only stretch so far. But tonight, as I tell you this story, I invite you to consider the invisible threads, the victories, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights. They are the heartbeat beneath every achievement, the quiet power that allowed them to grow into the people they are. And sometimes that is the only applause a grandmother ever receives. Signs of distance that grew colder, those were subtle at first, like frost forming overnight on a window you didn't notice until morning. At first it was a skipped phone call here, a late arrival there. They promised visits that didn't materialize. I'd wait at the corner of the driveway, peering down the street for a familiar car, only to see it pass by headlights fading, and that familiar pit of loneliness would settle in my stomach. Mainstream research shows that even minor reductions in contact can significantly impact the emotional bond between older caregivers and the younger generation. But statistics don't capture the hollow feeling of being forgotten in real time. I remember one evening standing by the kitchen sink, my hands sticky from washing the same plates for what felt like the 1,000th time, realizing they hadn't called all week. I tried to laugh it off, joking to myself that I was running a silent retreat with invisible guests. That's joke number 1 for this section, though it barely masked the ache. Children who grow up independent often assume that distance is harmless, but for those who gave everything, it feels like a slow unraveling. People still debate whether children naturally drift apart from grandparents or if it's a subtle form of neglect. Oddly enough, some inheritance customs only deepen the feeling of exclusion. In certain countries, grandchildren can inherit a share of wealth even if they had minimal contact with the elder who created it. It's a legal quirk that seems logical on paper but feels cruel in practice. You spend decades nurturing them only for official records to suggest your absence hardly mattered. The law doesn't measure emotional labor. Even small gestures began to disappear. Birthday calls that used to arrive promptly now came late or not at all. Homework questions that once sparked dialogue were answered tersely via text, if at all. I noticed that when they entered a room, my presence was no longer automatic in their awareness. I became part of the scenery, furniture that could be rearranged or ignored, and yet I still rooted for them like an invisible cheerleader at the stadium of life. I tried to engage, of course. I asked about school friends' ambitions in ways designed to invite conversation, but the responses were brief, clipped, rehearsed, like reading a summary instead of a story. I laughed once at the awkwardness, telling myself it was like living in a sitcom. Joke number 2 for this section, the grandmother who talks to walls and the walls talk back better. It didn't lessen the sting, but humor softened the edges of despair. There was an unexpected insight in those years, too. Anthropologists note that multi-generational households create unique social dynamics. When elders are caregivers, children often develop independence earlier, which is celebrated socially. But there's a hidden cost. The very independence that's praised can make the elder feel obsolete. That was me. I built them, I lifted them, and yet their growing wings pushed me to the sidelines. Even routine interactions became strained. Mealtime, once a lively arena of chatter and debate, became quiet, almost mechanical. They answered questions with the precision of someone filling forms, not engaging in dialogue. The warmth of laughter faded into polite acknowledgement. It's subtle, but these micro moments accumulate like water slowly eroding stone. People still debate whether generational detachment is inevitable or avoidable. I suspect it's a bit of both. I remember one specific evening when my grandson entered the room, phone in hand, eyes fixed on a game. I attempted small talk, asking about his day, the classes he enjoyed. His response? A brief, uninterested grunt. I smiled faintly, masking the disappointment, and returned to the counter where I was sorting laundry. I realized then that my role had changed. I was no longer the center of their lives, just an accessory to be acknowledged only when convenient. That realization hit harder than any argument ever could. The house itself began to echo with absence. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway only to find empty rooms. Their presence became digital photos, posts, messages. Physical connection dwindled, leaving me with pixels instead of hugs. Fringe fact: some cultures in Asia practice silent living, where grandparents and grandchildren coexist in the same house, but communicate minimally, believing that independence and respect are shown through space rather than words. I tried to convince myself that this distance was harmless, even beneficial, but the heart doesn't always obey rationality. Humor again provided a thin veil over the loneliness. I would tell myself that one day I'd charge rent for every empty chair in the house. Joke number 3, pay up, I carried you rent-free for 16 years. It made me chuckle quietly, though the echo of absence remained undeniable. Then there was the creeping anxiety. What if this distance became permanent? What if they forgot the small sacrifices the nights I stayed awake while they slept? What if my face faded from their memory as easily as the wallpaper patterns I had loved? Those thoughts accompanied me like shadows during quiet evenings, but I kept going because the work of love is not conditional on reciprocity. You continue even when the world forgets to applaud. Through it all, I tried to hold on to gratitude for the moments that remained. The small smiles when I prepared their favorite meals, the fleeting moments when they laughed at a joke I had told 1,000 times, the rare evenings when conversation flowed. Those moments were the islands in a growing ocean of absence. They reminded me why I had endured, why I had invested my life into their growth. And yet the cold signs persisted. A note here left unread a call that didn't come a holiday dinner without my invitation. The emotional distance had physical manifestations. The spaces between us felt wider than the streets I once paced, waiting for a glimpse of the car that never slowed down. Mainstream psychology explains that emotional neglect in adulthood often mirrors past experiences, creating cycles of detachment. But I was just observing quietly, a witness to a slow unraveling that no one else noticed. I spent hours reflecting on why this happened. Perhaps ambition, perhaps new friendships, perhaps the natural drift of life. Or maybe it was simply human nature, self-centered, short-sighted, unable to remember the unseen work of another's heart. People still debate whether love without recognition is wasted or whether the act itself preserves value independently. For me, the answer was simple. The love remained even when the acknowledgement did not. Through every small sign of coldness, I held on to the victories. They were not erased even if the warmth of reciprocity had. And as I stood in the quiet kitchen that evening, sorting the dishes in a house that felt emptier than the night outside, I realized that resilience is not built on applause, but on the enduring act of care itself. The day I realized I was unwanted, that day. It arrived like a sudden chill through a window left open all night. I had imagined family gatherings for years, rehearsing in my mind how warm and joyful they would feel, with laughter bouncing off the walls and the aroma of home-cooked meals filling every corner. But life rarely scripts scenes the way we hope. That day, it was a birthday dinner for my grandson. Invitations had been extended, and I prepared myself to feel the warmth of belonging once again. I polished the silverware, dusted the shelves, and even made a small cake. The scent of vanilla and sugar drifted through the house, a hopeful promise. Yet when I arrived, the atmosphere was different. Conversations lulled as I stepped through the door. My presence was acknowledged but not celebrated. My grandson barely looked up, absorbed in a device that demanded more attention than the room itself. My daughter and son-in-law exchanged glances, subtle but telling, as if I were a guest in a theater I had helped build. Mainstream family dynamics say tension like this can emerge in multi-generational households when roles and expectations clash. But no amount of theory can prepare you for the sting of emotional erasure. I remember standing in the doorway, clutching the cake plate, feeling a strange mix of hope and dread. I placed it carefully on the table, hoping it would be seen as a gesture of love. And then came the moment that carved itself into my memory. They bypassed me to serve themselves first, almost as if I were invisible. A casual oversight, perhaps, or maybe a reflection of how distant we had all become. People still debate whether children naturally grow indifferent to those who raise them or whether neglect seeps in by small, cumulative choices. There were other signs, subtle but unmistakable. The smallest invitations or casual mentions in conversation excluded me, a pattern that had been forming for months but became undeniable that evening. I had imagined the gathering as a culmination of years of sacrifice, a moment to be honored and appreciated. Instead, it was a subtle repudiation, a reminder that the bonds I had maintained through sheer persistence had weakened under the pressures of independence. I found humor, as I often do, though the laughter was dry and hollow. I told myself, well, at least the cake smells good, a weak attempt to mask the deep hurt. Joke number 1 for this section, though, it barely reached anyone. The children, absorbed in their devices and conversations, did not notice. The adults offered polite smiles, but the energy was absent, the warmth I expected simply wasn't there. Odd customs often highlight the strangeness of these moments. In some parts of Europe, elders are expected to host and guide family gatherings, but are then ceremonially acknowledged with gifts or verbal tributes to their role. The lack of such acknowledgement in my own home felt like a cultural void, a silent disconnection between expectation and reality. It was as though the years of dedication had been a rehearsal for a performance no one wanted to attend. The cake, once a symbol of love and celebration, became a metaphor. I watched as the slices were taken with little recognition of the effort it took to prepare them. My presence was tolerated, not honored. I quietly considered leaving the table, but I knew the act of remaining was itself a declaration. I was still part of this story, even if they did not notice. Joke number 2, maybe next year I'll just send a text with a virtual cake. The thought made me smile weakly, a tiny rebellion against the emptiness of the moment. As the evening progressed, I observed interactions, carefully noticing how subtle gestures and the avoidance of eye contact painted a clear picture. I was not wanted, at least not in the way I had imagined. Mainstream research shows that social exclusion even mild triggers a neurological response similar to physical pain. I felt it in every fiber of my being, a quiet ache of rejection and loss. It is strange, isn't it, that emotional absence can feel so vividly physical. I reflected on the years that had led me here. The nights spent awake when the children were sick, the early mornings preparing school lunches, the weekends sacrificed for activities and tutoring sessions. Every moment had been invested in their growth and happiness. And yet when the tables turned, when acknowledgement was due, the response was muted, almost imperceptible. People still debate whether unrecognized labor diminishes its value. I assure you, it does not. Only those who fail to notice may feel cheated. A minor incident punctuated the evening. My granddaughter dropped a fork, and the sound echoed more loudly in my ears than it seemed to anyone else's. I bent down to pick it up, and she barely glanced my way. A wave of loneliness washed over me, sharp and sudden. It was a reminder that the day's subtle exclusions were cumulative, each small act contributing to a profound sense of invisibility. The final blow came when the adults quietly discussed plans that did not include me. A vacation or relocation choices, about schooling decisions made with barely a glance toward the person who had maintained the household and nurtured the children through every formative year. I realized then that I had been removed from decision-making. My opinions no longer solicited my presence, merely ornamental. Joke number 3, I should have worn a name tag stating, "Grandmother, please consult before planning life." It was bitterly funny, though it failed to lighten the weight of isolation. I left that evening quietly, carrying the uneaten cake back to my car. The streets were dark, the air crisp, and I felt both the sting of rejection and the strange comfort of solitude. Oddly enough, some cultures view such departures as rites of passage for elders, a ceremonial acknowledgement that their caregiving role has shifted to spectatorship. In my case, the ceremony was informal, unspoken, and deeply personal. People still debate whether exclusion by choice or oversight matters more. To me, the result felt the same. The emotional distance was real and undeniable. Later that night, I sat in my empty living room, the hum of the refrigerator, the only companion reflecting on the subtle but unmistakable signs that had led to this realization. I thought about the small victories, the nights I stayed awake, the meals prepared, the encouragement given, and the invisible scaffolding I had built for them. And yet all of it seemed to weigh lightly in their perception. The world had moved forward without me, a constant reminder that devotion alone does not guarantee acknowledgement or gratitude. Despite the hurt, I clung to humor and resilience, my inner companions. I whispered to myself, at least the cake was delicious, and let that small joy anchor me. Even when love and effort go unnoticed, the act itself holds intrinsic value, a quiet truth that sustains one through disappointment. That night, I reaffirmed a lesson I had learned long ago. The measure of sacrifice is not in recognition, but in the enduring impact it leaves on those we nurture, whether they realize it or not. From home to facility, with clipped words, that was the turning point, the moment where all the subtle slights and absent gestures culminated into a tangible physical separation. I remember the phone call clearly, a terse, efficient explanation from my daughter, almost robotic in tone. "We've arranged for you to stay at a care home," she said, as if discussing a package delivery. No hesitation, no warmth, just facts delivered with professional indifference. The words struck me harder than any argument or disappointment could have. Mainstream family studies confirm that placing elderly relatives into institutional care often triggers profound emotional stress, not just for the elder, but for the ones left to bear the weight of guilt and societal judgment. And here I was, the one who had sacrificed everything, now being transferred as if I were luggage. I packed my small bag with meticulous care, trying to ignore the surreal absurdity of the situation. Oddly, in some countries, care homes encourage families to participate in the move, making it ceremonial to honor the elder's life. In my case, the ceremony was non-existent, a silent handover devoid of recognition or gratitude. People still debate whether this lack of ritual amplifies feelings of abandonment or simply reflects the harsh realities of modern life. I can tell you from experience, it feels like being erased. The drive to the facility was quiet. I looked out the window, passing streets filled with life laughter, spilling from open windows, the scent of evening meals drifting into the air. Memories flooded me the first time I brought children home from school, the small victories we celebrated in these neighborhoods, the walks to the corner store where we bought candy on special days. And now, I was a passenger in my own life being escorted to a place where those memories had no claim. I tried humor again, my instinctive shield. I whispered to myself, well, at least the view changes a feeble attempt to lighten the weight on my chest. Joke number 1 of this section, and it landed only in the empty space of the car. My daughter glanced at me, eyes flickering with something, remorse maybe, or perhaps impatience. I could not tell. Humor had always been my way to navigate the pain. Here it seemed almost absurd. At the facility, the staff greeted me with polite smiles, their uniforms crisp, the air perfumed with disinfectant. It smelled like efficiency, like order, not like home. They showed me to my room, a small, clean space with a single bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the garden. I ran my hand along the crisp sheets, the sterile surface devoid of personal warmth. Fringe fact, in some Scandinavian countries, elder care rooms are intentionally designed with minimal personal effects to encourage communal living and mobility, but it often leaves a newcomer feeling like a stranger in their own life. People still debate whether sterile efficiency outweighs emotional comfort in elder care. I unpacked my few belongings, placing them carefully on the dresser. Every item told a story, a photograph of my children as toddlers, a worn handkerchief embroidered with my initials, a small trinket from a long-ago vacation. These were tokens of my past, of the life I had built, of the love that had gone largely unacknowledged. They felt fragile against the clinical backdrop of the facility. During the first evening, I sat by the window listening to the distant hum of conversations and the faint clinking of utensils from the dining hall. Loneliness pressed in, not just the solitude of the room, but the emotional void left by the family who had escorted me here without explanation or affection. I reminded myself of the years I had dedicated, the nights I had stayed awake, the meals prepared, the guidance provided. All of it now seemed to hover in memory, untethered from recognition. I found resilience in small routines. I arranged my room meticulously, made a cup of tea just the way I liked it, and watched the sunset paint the sky in muted oranges and pinks. Humor remained a faint but steady companion. Joke number 2. At least no one will steal my favorite chair, I murmured to myself, and for a brief moment, the sterile walls felt less like a prison. Interaction with other residents was cautious at first. Everyone carried a story, a silent history etched into their expressions and postures. I discovered quickly that we were a collective of forgotten narratives, individuals transported into institutional life after decades of contribution elsewhere. Oddly, some cultures celebrate this stage of life with storytelling circles. But here, conversations were sparse, each resident guarding fragments of dignity and memory. People still debate whether communal engagement in elder facilities can replace familial acknowledgement. My experience suggested it offered solace, but it could not fully substitute for the warmth of kin. Meals were a revelation in structure. Served on trays with precise portions, conversations were minimal, and schedules were rigid. Mainstream family dynamics studies note that elders often experience a decline in self-agency when placed in structured routines that mimic hospitals more than homes. I felt the loss of autonomy keenly. The power to choose my own schedule, my own meals, my own interactions had been stripped. Humor became a whisper, a soft rebellion against the rigidity. Joke number 3, I suppose I can now nap on demand without anyone asking why. By the third day, I began observing patterns. Staff moved with practiced efficiency. Residents formed quiet alliances over shared frustrations or fleeting laughs, and I learned to navigate the unspoken codes. It was a world governed by schedules, silent agreements, and polite detachment. And yet there was dignity to be carved out if one knew where to look. The care was competent, even compassionate, but it lacked the emotional resonance I had known in the home I had built from scratch. In the evenings, I would sit by the window tracing the outlines of familiar trees beyond the garden fence, imagining the neighborhoods where I had spent decades raising children who had drifted from me. I reflected on the bittersweet irony my home had been filled with warmth, chaos, and love, while this facility offered quiet order and efficiency. Each had its value, but only one acknowledged the labor of love that had gone into raising a family from the ground up. Even as I adjusted to the facility, a deep awareness lingered. I had been moved, not for convenience, not for my own good, but for the comfort of others, my family, who sought to delegate responsibility without considering the emotional impact. Mainstream family studies confirm that relocation decisions made without consultation are often experienced as betrayal, not care. I felt that betrayal profoundly, a quiet, persistent ache beneath the routines that now governed my days. Through it all, I reminded myself love endures even when recognition does not. The years of sacrifice, the nights spent awake, the guidance and support provided, all of it remained a part of me. And while the walls of the facility enclosed me physically, my memories, humor, and quiet resilience remained untouchable. Loneliness behind the locked garden gates, it's a phrase that carries more weight than I could have imagined before experiencing it firsthand. The facility was well-kept flower beds lined the pathways. A small fountain trickled gently in the central courtyard, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with sun-warmed blooms. On the surface, it seemed peaceful, but peace is a peculiar companion when it arrives in the form of isolation. The gates were locked for safety, the paths patrolled for order, and yet the rules that protected us also contained us. Mainstream elder care studies suggest that restricted mobility can increase feelings of depression and disconnection in older adults. And they're right. I often walked along the paths, my steps slow, echoing in the empty morning. Some residents walked with me silently, while others kept to themselves entirely. You could sense the histories etched in their expressions, lives lived, responsibilities borne, and now memories held tight against the sterile backdrop of institutional care. Odd fact, in Japan, certain care facilities create labyrinthine gardens intentionally to encourage exploration and cognitive engagement, while simultaneously containing residents safely. The irony is that the design provides freedom within confinement, a metaphor for my own life, I realized. People still debate whether structured freedom can truly satisfy the human spirit when emotional bonds are missing. I found myself talking to the garden as if it could answer. How did we end up here? I would whisper, the petals swaying slightly as though acknowledging me. Humor became my subtle rebellion again. Joke number 1. Maybe the fountain knows all my secrets and promises not to tell. No one heard, but speaking aloud helped. I realized that talking even to a garden was preferable to the echoing emptiness of silence. Meals were scheduled strict and predictable. Breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. The trays were precise protein-starch vegetables, all portioned according to guidelines I could neither alter nor question. Some residents thrived on routine. Others simmered silently. I fell somewhere in between learning to take comfort in the predictability while grieving the loss of autonomy I had once taken for granted. Joke number 2. At least they won't question why I'm having 3 cups of tea instead of 1. Interactions with staff were polite but professional. I learned quickly to navigate the small social hierarchies, understanding who could be asked for favors, who could be engaged in conversation, and who preferred no interruptions. Each encounter was a subtle negotiation of dignity. Fringe fact: in Scandinavian elder care systems, staff are trained to recognize unspoken cues from eye contact to subtle gestures, ensuring residents feel noticed without overt attention. I appreciated the skill, but it still didn't replace the warmth of familial acknowledgement. People still debate whether emotional intelligence in care staff can fully substitute for family presence. I developed routines to anchor myself. Every morning, I would sit by the window, watching the sun rise over the courtyard, tracing patterns of light across the floor. I wrote in my journal, noting the small victories: a resident who smiled at me, a hummingbird that visited the garden, a new flower blooming near the fountain. These were moments of control and joy, however minor. Humor served as a bridge. Joke number 3. I'm practically running a botanical investigation here. Next week I'll charge rent for the hummingbirds. Evenings were the hardest. The sun would dip, shadows lengthened across the courtyard, and the quiet became heavy. Other residents retreated to their rooms, the staff completed their rounds, and I was left with my thoughts, memories, and longing. The years I had spent raising my grandchildren played like a silent film in my mind. Birthdays, celebrated homework assignments, guided, scraped knees, kissed, and midnight snacks shared. All of it seemed a lifetime away, and yet it was only a few short months ago that my presence had been central in their lives. I reflected on the irony. I had devoted decades to family teaching lessons, guiding them, nurturing them, and now I observed from the sidelines as if I had been erased. Mainstream psychology indicates that perceived abandonment in elders can lead to significant emotional distress even when they are physically cared for. I felt the truth of that in every quiet evening, every locked gate, every polite but distant interaction. I found comfort in small acts of rebellion. I decorated my room with photographs, mementos, and a few personal items that reminded me of home. I arranged the flowers in my windowsill in patterns that pleased me. I baked small treats when permitted and shared them discreetly with staff and residents who appreciated the gesture. These were my ways of asserting presence, of saying I exist here even if my family does not see me. There were moments of connection, fleeting but precious. A resident shared stories of his own childhood, of parents and grandparents long gone, and I listened, offering empathy and understanding. Another asked for help with a crossword puzzle, and I delighted in providing guidance. These interactions reminded me that human bonds are not solely defined by family. They can be found, nurtured, and valued even in unexpected places. Yet the shadow of absence remained. Each night, I lay in bed listening to the muted sounds of the facility, feeling the pulse of the world beyond the gates. I imagined the streets, the parks, the homes where my children and grandchildren were now engaged in lives that rarely included me. The quiet ache was sharp, a persistent reminder of the love invested and the acknowledgement withheld. Through it all, I cultivated a quiet resilience, I reminded myself that my sacrifices were not invalidated by absence. I had raised children with care, guided them through formative years, and instilled values that would shape their lives in ways I might never witness. The locked gates were physical, but they could not contain the imprint of decades of devotion. And so I walked the courtyard daily, tended to small rituals, and allowed myself the solace of memories. Humor and reflection became companions, sustaining me through loneliness and the invisible weight of emotional separation. Even as the facility enclosed me, the essence of the home I had created, the warmth, the laughter, the love remained unbroken within me. Family portraits that no longer include me, this was the cruel punctuation mark in the story of my life. I remember scrolling through a social media feed one afternoon casually, at first expecting the usual snapshots, birthdays, school plays, vacations. But as I swiped, my stomach sank. There were images of my grandchildren, of family gatherings, of milestones I had once helped orchestrate, and yet conspicuously absent was any sign of me. The grandmother who had baked the cakes, sewn the costumes, stayed awake during fevers gone erased from the curated narrative. Mainstream studies on digital memory suggest that social media curation can distort real relationships, but I felt the distortion physically as a tightening in my chest. Oddly, in some cultures, grandparents are expected to be the centerpiece in photographs, honored as the roots of the family tree. Here, that practice had vanished. People still debate whether exclusion from family imagery is merely aesthetic or a reflection of deeper emotional distancing. I felt it keenly. Each image was a silent declaration that my presence no longer mattered. I found humor in the absurdity, of course. Joke number 1. Perhaps they hired an invisibility photographer and forgot to tell me. I chuckled quietly, though the laugh felt brittle against the ache. Even in invisibility, I sought agency, subtle rebellion through wit. I started documenting my own small acts of defiance. I captured snapshots of my daily routines, the flowers on my windowsill, the orderly arrangements of my room. Each photo was a quiet assertion. I exist, I lived, I mattered. There is something about visual representation that restores a measure of control, even when it feels like the world has overlooked you. The absence became a conversation with myself. I asked, do they remember the bedtime stories, the pancake mornings, the way I stayed awake while they slept? And then I reminded myself those memories are preserved in the marrow of my own life, impervious to omission. Fringe fact: some families employ digital archives to remember absent elders, scanning letters, photographs, and personal writings into shared cloud spaces. Yet these practices are sporadic and rarely capture the emotional depth embedded in daily sacrifices. Humor again served as a bridge. Joke number 2: maybe one day my invisibility will be trendy. I laughed quietly, the corners of my eyes crinkling. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a small shield against the sting of omission. There were moments when physical interactions reminded me that bonds had shifted. The casual touch of a hand, the brief greeting, the perfunctory conversation, all underscored the emotional distance. Mainstream family dynamics often describe this as a gradual recalibration of relationships over time, yet the impact on the elders' sense of belonging is profound. I felt it in my bones each day, a subtle but relentless echo of neglect. I spent hours reflecting on the meaning of presence. Was it enough that I had invested decades into nurturing and guidance? Or did my absence from visual representation indicate a deeper rejection, a symbolic dismissal of my role in their lives? People still debate whether being physically present outweighs the importance of acknowledgement and recognition. In my case, it was clear acknowledgement matters. Oddly, some residents in the facility offered companionship, sharing stories of exclusion or erasure from their own families. We became inadvertent witnesses to each other's lives, forming quiet connections that validated our experiences. These moments were small yet precious, like finding light in an otherwise dim corridor. Humor persisted as a coping mechanism. Joke number 3: we'll start our own gallery, Grandmothers Who Exist. We laughed a fragile but genuine sound, one that stitched temporary warmth into the cold corridors. I observed the dynamics among the staff as well. Some treated us with routine politeness, others with genuine concern. Yet none could fully compensate for the emotional gap left by family absence. Mainstream research notes that institutional care often focuses on physical well-being while underestimating the importance of emotional and relational continuity. I experienced that firsthand. Meals were served rooms, cleaned, health monitored, but acknowledgement of my lifelong contributions was absent. Even in solitude, I nurtured small rituals. I tended the flowers outside my window, arranging them by color and size. I organized my room meticulously, finding comfort in the order I could control. I wrote letters that I never sent, capturing memories and reflections for posterity, even if no one would read them. These practices reminded me that agency can survive invisibility and dignity can be maintained even when recognition is withheld. The most painful moments, however, were the ones that reminded me of absence indirectly. Photographs displayed on digital frames, social media posts celebrating milestones, glimpses of family celebrations I had been excluded from these became the silent punctuation of a life partially erased. I would pause, take a deep breath, and remind myself that love is not always contingent on acknowledgement, even if the human heart longs for it. By the end of each day, I returned to my small room, observing the shadows cast by the evening light. I recited memories quietly, the details of birthdays, school plays, late-night homework sessions, and morning pancakes. I whispered to myself that those moments mattered, that they were imprinted in ways unseen and tangible, yet indelible. Fringe practice in some elder care programs encourages storytelling to preserve identity and memory. I engaged in my own personal storytelling, a quiet assertion of existence and impact. The garden outside continued to offer small moments of solace. Birds visited, flowers bloomed, and the wind carried distant sounds of life from the outside world. I observed these details with heightened awareness, savoring the rhythms of the environment. It became a meditation, a practice of presence, despite exclusion, a subtle reclaiming of agency in a space that could otherwise feel alien. And so the portraits that excluded me became symbols not just of absence, but of endurance. They reminded me of what I had given, what I had endured, and what I continued to cultivate internally. The human spirit, I realized, can persist even when the external world erases its traces. Recognition is gratifying, but survival of the self, emotional, intellectual, and moral, is paramount. In reflecting on this, I found a paradoxical sense of strength. The lack of acknowledgement by my family reinforced the necessity of self-validation. I could not rely on external affirmation. I had to cultivate internal recognition of my own sacrifices and achievements. Humor, memory routine, and small acts of rebellion became my anchors. And through these, I reclaimed a measure of control, dignity, and continuity, even as the physical and digital portraits of my family omitted my presence. The inheritance question, nobody dares voice, that's a shadow that hangs over every conversation I have with my children now. It's unspoken, a tension that simmers beneath the surface, noticed only in the way eyes flicker, hands fidget, and silences stretch longer than they should. I remember the first time the topic surfaced indirectly, a casual mention of wills of assets, of future planning. The words were soft, polite, and yet loaded with expectation. Mainstream research confirms that discussions about inheritance often expose the deepest fissures in family relationships, and I felt that fissure widen with every passing year. Oddly enough, inheritance laws can be surprisingly specific or bizarrely vague, depending on where you live. In some jurisdictions, grandchildren can be included or excluded from wills entirely at the discretion of parents, even if grandparents raise them. This strange loophole seems designed to create tension, or perhaps to acknowledge the complexity of family structures. People still debate whether formal legal recognition of care and support should influence inheritance rights. In my case, it's both ironic and painful. I raised them, shaped their lives, and yet the law does not always honor that contribution. I try to keep humor close to soften the edges. Joke number 1. Maybe I should have drafted a secret will on a napkin just to keep them guessing. A faint smile forms, though the humor doesn't erase the ache. It's a delicate dance balancing laughter with the gravity of what it represents. The conversations about inheritance are rarely direct. They come as offhand remarks. We should think about future planning, or, "Mom, have you considered your options?" My heart races as I parse the meaning behind the words. Are they thoughtful, oblivious, self-serving? The ambiguity gnaws at me. Mainstream family dynamics. Research indicates that elders often interpret vague discussions of inheritance as a litmus test for familial loyalty. I can attest the interpretation is exhausting. I remember the nights spent reviewing documents trying to understand my rights, my options, my future. Fringe fact, some countries offer forced heirship guaranteeing a portion of an estate to descendants regardless of wills. Yet even in those cases, the distribution rarely accounts for emotional labor, the decades of care, the sleepless nights, the silent sacrifices that built the family in the first place. People still debate whether emotional contribution should have legal weight. I believe it should. Humor remains a lifeline. Joke number 2, maybe I'll leave my collection of cookie jars to the cat. They at least appreciate the sentiment. I chuckle quietly to myself, a small rebellion against the cold arithmetic of assets versus affection. The tension is amplified by subtle cues. During family gatherings, inheritance is never spoken of directly, but the energy changes when topics of property money or legacies are mentioned. Eyes dart, glances exchange, and I sense the unspoken question, how much will she leave us? The weight of these silent calculations presses against the warmth that might have existed. Mainstream research suggests that even implied expectations of inheritance can strain family bonds, sometimes irreversibly. I recall a specific instance, a casual conversation over tea, my granddaughter innocently asking about the old house, wondering aloud what would happen to it one day. I hesitated carefully, neutral, knowing that any response could ignite speculation or disappointment. Fringe fact, in some cultures, elders intentionally obscure inheritance plans to preserve harmony, only revealing details at the moment of transfer. People still debate whether transparency or discretion fosters stronger family bonds. I am torn. Honesty feels just, but discretion preserves peace. Through it all, I observe myself. My feelings fluctuate between pride, frustration, and quiet resignation. Humor punctuates the tension. Joke number 3, I'll leave them my stories. They're priceless and impossible to steal. The quip is private, a balm against the gnawing anxiety. The inheritance question is inseparable from identity. I am more than my possessions, more than my home, more than what can be legally quantified. Yet in the eyes of some family members, the tangible assets carry symbolic weight, overshadowing the intangible contributions that truly shape their lives. Mainstream research shows that families often confuse material inheritance with emotional legacy, leading to misunderstandings, resentment, and fractured relationships. I experience that disconnect every day. Even as I navigate these delicate matters, I hold on to memory, humor, and subtle rebellion as instruments of survival. I organize my papers meticulously, revisit old photographs, and recount stories of sacrifices and victories that cannot be erased by legal definitions. I find solace in small rituals, arranging my belongings just so, brewing the perfect cup of tea, walking the courtyard paths with deliberate care. Each act affirms my presence, my value, and my agency, even when formal recognition is absent. The elders around me offer camaraderie and reflection. We share experiences, subtly validating each other's invisible labor. One tells of raising children while managing a farm, another of tutoring grandchildren through nights of illness. We acknowledge each other's stories, finding resonance and quiet affirmation. Humor binds us. Joke number 4. At least in here, the only thing we fight over is the last cookie. Laughter rises softly, a temporary reprieve from the weight of exclusion and anticipation. The inheritance question lingers like a shadow, unspoken but omnipresent. It shapes interactions, colors, emotions, and influences perception. I meditate on the truth that while legal structures may quantify wealth, they cannot measure love, sacrifice, or resilience. The quiet acts of devotion that defined my life raising children, guiding grandchildren, nurturing without expectation, remain untouched by legal calculus. People still debate whether legacy is monetary or moral. I know it is both and neither simultaneously. In the evenings, I sit by the window watching sunlight streak across the courtyard. I think of the years invested in shaping the lives of the young people now beyond my immediate reach. Each victory, each lesson, each quiet act of love endures as an invisible inheritance, intangible but potent. It sustains me, affirms me, and provides the quiet comfort of knowing that my impact is real even if unacknowledged by those who will inherit. And so the unvoiced question of inheritance becomes a lens through which I examine the entire arc of my life. It is not merely about property, money, or possessions. It is about recognition, validation, and the human desire for continuity. My resilience, humor, and internal sense of worth serve as bulwarks against the void created by unspoken expectations and omissions. I navigate this terrain with care, preserving dignity while accepting the complexity of familial dynamics, a fading name in their busy world that's the quiet heartbreak of this stage of life. I sit in my small room listening to the hum of the air conditioning, watching shadows move across the walls, and I realize that the people who once needed me most now exist in a universe where I am peripheral. Notifications ping on their phones, updates arrive on social media, celebrations unfold in posts and stories, and my name, once uttered in warmth, laughter, and guidance, remains absent. Mainstream family dynamics suggest that as children grow and establish independent lives, grandparents' visibility diminishes. But the emotional impact of that fading presence is profound, even when care and concern remain in principle. I observe my own reactions carefully. I have learned to find humor in the subtle absurdities of invisibility. Joke number 1. At least no one can text me in the middle of the night asking for snacks. It's a dry, private joke, yet it offers a tiny shield against the ache of being sidelined. The world moves quickly, and when you are no longer central, each omission feels amplified, a reminder that presence alone is insufficient without acknowledgement. Oddly, some cultural customs maintain elders' relevance through ritualized respect. In parts of Africa, elders are still consulted in community decision-making and celebrated through public acknowledgement, ensuring their names remain intertwined with the lives they have shaped. People still debate whether physical absence necessarily erases influence. I have learned that emotional and moral legacies endure even when outward recognition diminishes. I spend hours reflecting on memory ritual and the traces of impact left behind. Each achievement of my grandchildren, each small victory they attain is a testament to the foundation I helped build. I take quiet satisfaction in knowing that my influence is embedded in their character, though unseen and unspoken. Humor continues to temper the loneliness. Joke number 2 may be my legacy as being the invisible superhero of their childhood. The thought brings a smile, albeit faint and wistful. The fading of my name is also marked by the absence of stories, the omission of acknowledgments. Birthdays pass with minimal fanfare directed toward me, holidays are celebrated without my participation, and milestones occur without a nod to the foundational role I once played. Fringe fact, in some societies, elders are intentionally omitted from public narratives to encourage younger generations' autonomy. People still debate whether this omission is protective or alienating. I feel both the intention may be benign, but the result is stark isolation. Humor and observation serve as anchors. Joke number 3. At least I'll never have to suffer through awkward Zoom calls about minor disputes. The levity is small, yet it preserves agency and provides perspective in a world increasingly dominated by absence and digital representation. I navigate the facility's routines, engage with other residents, and cultivate personal rituals to maintain connection to life's pleasures. Even small gestures become significant. I arrange flowers, meticulously maintain my room with care, and create routines that assert presence, control, and identity. Each act of attention is a quiet declaration. I exist, I have influence, and I am worthy of acknowledgement. Mainstream research suggests that elders who preserve agency and routine experience higher psychological well-being, even when familial recognition diminishes. I can attest to that. The routines are lifelines, reminders of selfhood in a world that increasingly ignores me. The fading name is reinforced by the virtual world. Social media posts celebrate the family's life, yet I am rarely tagged, rarely acknowledged. The digital omission mirrors the physical absence, becomes visibility in reverse. Observing these patterns, I reflect on resilience, humor, and memory as tools to navigate erasure. People still debate whether the digital representation of family life should include elders. In practice, omission can feel as stark as physical exclusion. I find solace in storytelling. Writing letters never sent, journaling, recording memories, and capturing reflections allow me to assert identity beyond the perception of others. The act itself becomes the acknowledgement I crave. Fringe practice in some elder care systems encourages self-narration as a way to maintain agency, dignity, and identity. For me, it is indispensable. Each written word reaffirms my presence and preserves the impact of decades of care. Even as my name fades in their busy world, I hold on to humor, memory, and personal rituals. Joke number 4, if I vanish completely, at least my stories are highly entertaining ghost material. Laughter, even when private, bridges the gap between fading presence and enduring identity. In the quiet hours, I meditate on continuity. My influence, while invisible in social or digital spaces, remains embedded in the habits, values, and choices of those I raised. The emotional and moral legacy is the inheritance that transcends legal or material recognition. Even as they navigate independent lives unaware of the depth of my sacrifices, the echoes of my guidance persist. The courtyard outside continues to offer comfort. Birds flit among the trees, flowers bloom, and the sun casts shifting shadows. I walk the paths mindful of each step and allow small observations to anchor me. Each sensory detail, the chirp of a bird, the rustle of leaves, the warmth of sunlight, becomes a gentle reminder that life continues, and that my role, though less visible, is meaningful. And as I reflect on the fading of my name, I realize that resilience, humor, and agency are the pillars sustaining me. Recognition, while desired, is not required for the value of a life well lived. The emotional, moral, and practical contributions I made endure in ways that are invisible, yet potent. My identity remains intact, my presence persists, and my legacy, though unacknowledged in their busy world, is firmly rooted in the lives I shaped and nurtured. As I sit by the window one last time, the courtyard bathed in the soft glow of evening, I reflect on a lifetime of love, sacrifice, and quiet resilience. The small victories, the laughter shared over burnt pancakes, the nights spent awake, tending scraped knees and fevered foreheads, all of it remains etched into the fabric of who I am. Even if my name has faded in their busy world, even if my presence is absent from photos and celebrations, the impact of my care is enduring. Memory is a powerful inheritance, invisible yet indelible, and it sustains me in ways no recognition can replicate. Humor, my loyal companion, remains the private jokes whispered to myself in empty corridors, the small rebellions of imagination that keep my spirit lively. Joke number 1, I raised superheroes without a cape. Invisibility is just their superpower now. And yet beneath the laughter lies pride. Pride for having raised children and grandchildren with integrity, compassion, and unwavering devotion. Pride that they carry pieces of me in their character, whether they realize it or not. I encourage everyone watching tonight to reflect on the elders in their lives, the invisible labor, the quiet guidance, the sacrifices made in silence. Sometimes love does not arrive with applause, and sometimes acknowledgement comes only in echoes. But it is real, and it matters. Let us honor the stories, the struggles, and the resilience that live quietly behind the scenes, shaping generations in ways the world rarely notices. So to my subscribers and supporters, thank you for bearing witness, for sharing in this journey of reflection and empathy. May you carry these lessons of patience, humor, and enduring love into your own families. Now turn off the lights, let the evening settle gently, and rest knowing that even invisible acts of devotion leave a lasting imprint on the world. Good night, and may your own stories of love and resilience shine quietly but powerfully, no matter who sees them.